Netanyahu sat in his office surrounded by advisors, the screens glowing with reports from across Africa, yet his eyes kept drifting past the words, dismissing them as background noise. Warnings had been coming in for weeks, direct and unfiltered from Ouagadougou, carrying the voice of a man who spoke without fear, a man who had already defied France, stared down the West, and stood unwavering against every form of intimidation they had thrown his way. That man was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and his tone in those messages was not one of negotiation, it was the voice of someone announcing inevitable consequences. Still, Netanyahu waved them aside. In his mind, Burkina Faso was small, its power symbolic at best, its reach too short to matter in the grand machinery of global politics. What could a young revolutionary, barely in his mid-30s, truly do to a leader who had weathered decades of conflict and high-stakes diplomacy? To him, Traoré's words were bluffs in a game he had already mastered. The truth was, those warnings were not just words, they were signals of tectonic shifts happening beneath the surface. Netanyahu's intelligence teams flagged them as heightened rhetoric, a term that belied the reality of a man moving armies, alliances, and resources like chess pieces on a board most in the West didn't even know existed. Each statement from Traoré was sharper than the last, stripped of diplomatic padding, delivered with the raw confidence of someone who understood the weight of his people's support and the rising tide of continental unity. Yet Netanyahu didn't flinch. He was convinced this was just another loud voice from the global south, something he could outwait, outtalk, or outmaneuver with a few quiet deals behind closed doors. But this time, the stage was different. Traoré wasn't speaking from a position of desperation, he was speaking from a position of momentum. His government had just dismantled decades of French military presence, reclaimed key mining sectors from foreign control, and gained admiration from leaders and citizens far beyond his borders. Netanyahu's inner circle urged caution, whispering about the growing sentiment against external interference in Africa, the dangerous precedent of losing influence in a strategically vital region, and the ripple effect it could have across the Middle East. Still, he brushed it off. He believed the West African leader's rise was temporary, a wave that would crash soon enough against the hard wall of realpolitik. What Netanyahu failed to see was that Traoré's warnings were not about Burkina Faso alone, they were about the shift of an entire region's heartbeat. Every message carried the echo of a continent waking up, refusing to be dictated to by faraway capitals. The language was unapologetic, and the subtext was clear: Africa was not just watching, it was moving, and any leader who ignored that movement would be left behind. Netanyahu, seasoned in navigating the fires of the Middle East, underestimated the fire now burning across West Africa. He had faced uprisings, wars, and diplomatic isolation before, but this was different. This was not a fragile rebellion, this was a movement rooted in the soil, backed by history, and fed by the hunger for sovereignty. His aides brought him intelligence briefings showing how Traoré had become a symbol far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, inspiring leaders in Mali, Niger, and beyond to take unprecedented stances against long-standing Western dominance. They showed him footage of massive crowds in Ouagadougou, waving flags, chanting for unity, denouncing external control. They showed him intercepted communications suggesting that Traoré's next steps could cut into the very arteries of Israel's quiet influence in African security and trade. Netanyahu barely glanced at them. His attention was fixed on other pressing matters: domestic unrest, regional threats, and his own political survival at home. In his calculation, a small, landlocked nation in West Africa simply couldn't shift the balance of his strategic chessboard. And yet, that was the miscalculation that would echo the loudest. For every warning ignored, Traoré's resolve deepened. For every dismissive glance, another door closed for Netanyahu to act preemptively. The young captain wasn't just sending political warnings, he was sending a countdown. And every tick of that clock was moving toward an event designed to catch the world off guard. Netanyahu didn't hear the urgency in Traoré's tone because he didn't believe someone from that position could hold such leverage. But power in the modern world doesn't always come from military might or economic dominance, it comes from controlling the momentum of narratives, alliances, and the hearts of people ready to act. Netanyahu's dismissal wasn't just arrogance, it was the weight of old habits. For decades, leaders like him had operated on the assumption that global power was a one-way street, where the strong dictated and the weak adjusted. In that paradigm, warnings from the so-called periphery were always just noise, never the thunder before the storm. But in those overlooked messages lay a clear statement: if ignored, Traoré would not just respond, he would redefine the playing field. That message was delivered plainly, without theatrics, and yet it carried the force of a war drum. Netanyahu chose not to listen. Each ignored warning allowed Traoré to sharpen his strategy. Every delay in response gave him more time to secure allies, tighten his internal grip, and prepare actions that could not be easily reversed. Netanyahu might have believed that ignoring him was a way to starve him of legitimacy. In reality, it only fueled the perception that the West and its allies refused to engage with African leaders on equal terms, reinforcing Traoré's narrative and swelling his support base. Netanyahu may have thought silence was strength, but in this case, silence was an open invitation for Traoré to act unchallenged. The missed opportunity wasn't just diplomatic, it was strategic. Israel's ties in Africa had been quietly expanding for years, particularly in security and intelligence. West Africa's ports, resources, and political alliances were critical nodes in a larger network of influence. By disregarding Traoré's direct communications, Netanyahu wasn't simply ignoring a leader, he was ignoring a growing fracture line in a region that could shift loyalties overnight. Those cracks would soon become the channels through which new alliances would pour, reshaping the map of influence that had been stable for decades. Netanyahu's confidence came from surviving countless threats, but survival in politics often breeds a dangerous form of tunnel vision. He could recognize danger when it roared in front of him but not when it whispered from the edges of his attention. Traoré's voice was that whisper, one he didn't realize was gaining amplification every single day. By the time Netanyahu turned his gaze fully toward West Africa, it would no longer be a whisper, it would be a declaration broadcast to the world, backed by a coalition he never thought possible. Ignoring Traoré wasn't a passive act, it was the opening move in a chain of events Netanyahu could no longer control. The clock had been ticking the moment the first warning arrived, and each second that passed without action brought the world closer to the shockwave that was coming. Netanyahu thought he was preserving his position. In reality, he was paving the way for one of the most unexpected geopolitical plays of the decade. And when the move finally came, it wouldn't just rattle Tel Aviv, it would make Brussels question whether they had been asleep at the wheel the entire time.